Hello everybody and welcome to the Drydock, episode 195. Now once again, if all is going to plan, then this is coming to you, hopefully if you're listening to it on the day of release, whilst I'm somewhere on or within USS Midway. But that aside, the topics of conversation for this week are the questions taken from Guide 243, that's the guide to USS Boston of 1884, as well as the video on HMAS Armidale, the Australian sloop that took a fair old beating, unfortunately, at the hands of the Japanese, and includes one of, if not my favourite, survivors' accounts, veterans' accounts, so far on this channel. Plus the Dystopian Wars video on the Great White Fleet, the American ships. So, let's begin. Brendan Buersdorf asks, what is the best size of ship, in your opinion, for submarine hunting? Is a destroyer truly the best? Or are frigates, minesweepers, corvettes and other various small ship classes capable of being just effective? I think overall the frigate, or if you're in World War II era US Navy parlance, the destroyer escort, is probably the best balance of size of ship for sub-hunting in that particular era, bearing in mind the question last week about why small destroyers were then converted into frigates post-war. Partly it's because destroyers were, even in the US, relatively speaking, short supply. Yes, the US had tons and tons of Fletchers, but they also had lots and lots of carriers that needed escorting. So destroyers are best left doing the main fleet protection role. They're for small ships, relatively big and expensive. Frigates can do pretty much everything a destroyer can do in the World War I or World War II era context when it comes to sub-hunting, and they're smaller and cheaper and therefore can be built in much larger numbers. And critically, when you're talking about escorting convoys, because they're available in much larger numbers, they can be at more points around the convoy at any given time. If you are going to escort a convoy with a proportion of your destroyer strength, then you might only have 2 or 3 destroyers covering the entire convoy, whereas if you're using frigates, you might have 6 or 7 frigates available to cover the entire convoy on a proportional basis, and so forth and so on. So the frigate, I think, is the perfect balance for the World War I, World War II period. The corvettes are good, but they are more purely defensive anti-submarine warfare assets because they don't have the speed to chase down U-boats over long distances, basically, and then catch up with the convoy again, whereas the frigate or destroyer escort does have that capability. Obviously, the destroyer is even better because the destroyer can hit 30 plus knots, but as I said, resource scarcity in terms of destroyers is, I think, definitely a thing. Scott Mason asks, I used to live in the town of Albany in southwestern Australia, and I was wondering if it would have warranted any naval defences in either of the world wars. I know the first convoy of Anzacs used the port as a starting point before being sent to Europe in World War I, so I'm assuming it should have had either some more defences than a single army base that I've seen, or at least some ships based there. There were in fact some coastal defences around Albany. Fort Princess Royal and Fort Plantagenet, the former mounting 2 guns, the latter mounting a single gun, all of 6-inch calibre, initially built in the latter part of the 19th century and subsequently upgraded, well, not so much in size, but in terms of number of guns. Well, not number of guns, type of guns. So they started off with, as you might imagine, short barrel, late 19th century 6-inch guns, and then through the early 20th century up till the early 1950s, they were upgraded with a couple of different iterations of newer, longer barrel 6-inch guns, which could therefore reach further out and hit harder. I know it doesn't sound like an awful lot, but to be honest, one of Albany's main defences was the fact it's on the southwestern tip of Australia. It's going to take quite a while for any potential enemies to get there. You know, there's no great Antarctican navy to come after you, so if an enemy, whether that be Russia or France or Germany in the late 19th, early 20th centuries, or Japan in World War II, was going to come for Albany, then it's either going to be a raider, a fast raider, converted merchantman, small cruiser, in which case the 6-inch guns are probably going to be perfectly adequate to see them off, or it's going to be major warships, at which point the Australian Navy and the Royal Navy should have had more than enough warning by the time they get to Albany to scramble some ships in its defence. And, of course, at times like when the Anzac convoys were heading out, there were ships allocated to the escort of the convoys, and thus, while the convoy was gathering, the defence of the harbour. Although, as far as I can tell, there doesn't seem to have been any kind of long-term ongoing significant naval stationing in Albany itself, in terms of, a cruiser or something. Armando Matos asks, how good were Gibraltar's defences against surface targets? If there was an opening when, say, the Queen Elizabeths and Force H were occupied in the eastern Mediterranean, could the Italians have taken the Littorios and bombarded Gibraltar at night, like the Congos did to Henderson Field? And if so, how do you see such an operation unfolding, and how would the British respond? If there were such a hypothetical opening, and bearing in mind the British took great pains to ensure there wasn't, the single biggest problem the Italians are going to face is Gibraltar itself. So this is near enough as makes no difference the very southern tip of Gibraltar looking north when I was there last year. And it kind of illustrates a little bit of the issue. The Littorio's guns massively outrange the available defensive guns on Gibraltar. The biggest gun on Gibraltar is a 17.7-inch 100-ton gun in the Magdala battery, but that's also a 1870s, 1880s era gun, identical in fact to the one that you'd find on the Italia-class ironclads. So for all its massive size, it's not exactly got a tremendous amount of range. The guns that can actually reach any appreciable distance and could bear over the widest arc are the 9.2-inch guns, some of which you can't see in this photo because they're mounted in a battery that is just obscured by that little bit of cloud that's ticking over the top of the rock. There's a couple of others a little bit closer as well. Now, obviously, a World War I era 9.2-inch gun isn't going to be too much trouble to a Littorio-class battleship at long range, but this is where we come back to Gibraltar itself being the problem. The 9.2-inch guns can easily reach across the Straits of Gibraltar. The Straits from the position of the gun batteries are just a fraction over 20,000 yards wide. So most of the excess range that something like a Littorio has doesn't actually apply because a Littorio is not a land-going battleship. There's a limited amount of distance. Now, in theory, you could argue that a Littorio that maybe went east of Ceuta, or Ceuta, or however it's pronounced, basically the little Spanish enclave in Morocco to the south of Gibraltar, if you went east of there and then headed south, you could work your way in such a manner that you could get far enough away from Gibraltar and then bombard it that the shore defences wouldn't be able to touch you. The problem is, this is basically the attack profile. So all of the juicy stuff, the dockyards, etc., are on the west side of the rock. And the east side of the rock is near enough vertical, so you're not going to be attacking from there. And this is pretty much the best angle you're going to get. And you can see, although the southern end of the promontory isn't exactly as tall as the northern end, it's still fairly substantial. So you're either going to be somewhere east of Morocco firing at massive distances without knowing exactly where your shells are hitting because you can't see over the rocks. Chances are, unless you go really far away, your shells are going to smash into the rocks instead. And if you send something like, say, a scout plane over to spot the fall of shot, well, Gibraltar does have air defences, both in the form of aircraft and anti-aircraft guns. And bear in mind, this photo is taken from the relatively flat area on the southern promontory. You can probably just about see there to the right. I'm already standing on a fairly substantial cliff, which you would have to climb down to get to sea level. So you've got that elevation up to here, plus this elevation of promontory, and as you can see, there's a wall in the pass. So it's a fairly substantial blocking option. If you want to have clear line of sight to where you're shooting, and not have the chance of your salvo smashing into just so much rock which will absorb your shells quite happily, you have to come round Ceuta into the Straits of Gibraltar, at which point, A, you're in range of practically everything but the 17.7-inch gun, which is probably not going to end particularly well, and B, you also start running into issues about, Spanish territorial waters. If you're going to respect at least the 3-mile limit, that's going to push you well inside 17,000 yards. And, British submarines that are based in the area, mines, etc., are going to play merry hell with anything you might try and do. And that's assuming that the entire width of the Strait of Gibraltar is even navigable. Luckily, a good chunk of it actually is in the area of Gibraltar itself, but I say that's why it's filled with mines and so forth. So, yes, in theory, an Italian bombardment force could come in to hit Gibraltar at night. The problem they're going to have is that in order to actually, A, see anything to hit, and B, not just expend their shells uselessly into millions upon millions of tons of rock, they're going to have to get suicidally close in a choke point that's already got submarines and mines waiting for them anyway, at which point it's going to cause far more damage to the Italians than it's ever going to cause to Gibraltar, in all likelihood. Lord Oceanus asks, if Malta had failed to be supplied, would the Italians or Germans have made an attempt to take the island? And if so, would they have been able to land a sufficient force in the face of the Royal Navy's Mediterranean fleet? Well, there was a plan to attack Malta regardless, involving aerial drops by Fallschirmjäger and Italian paratroops, along with a seaborne invasion. Now, the thing is, if Malta had not been supplied and had run out of food, fuel, ammunition, etc., etc., it wouldn't have been an attempt to take the island. The island probably would have had to surrender because the alternative would have been starvation. So, complete failure to supply Malta, and the Italians and Germans get it basically for free. If, let's say, vigorous harpoon, halberd, etc. are less successful, and supplies in Malta continue to run low and are known to be running low, and the Germans and Italians try to take the island using the plan that was on paper anyway, then yes, in theory, on paper, they did have a plan for sufficient forces to land to take the island. Given that, well, we know what happened to the Fallschirmjäger in Crete, and Malta is even worse terrain to drop into than Crete, and had a far, far, far heavier battery of anti-aircraft guns and obviously aircraft and so forth. It's, I would say, fairly likely that the airborne element of the operation would have failed, between losses to the actual aircraft dropping the paratroops and losses to the paratroops themselves from a lot of anti-aircraft fire and landing in terrain that's basically designed to break parachutists' ankles and legs. Yeah, I don't think that would have gone very well at all. Plus, the Maltese were not especially enthusiastic about the idea of seeing Germans or Italians on their soil. The seaborne element, on the other hand, yes, in theory they could have actually done that, at least on paper, because they had the plan, at least, involved several divisions, 2 to 3, depending on exactly what iteration of the plan, protected by the Regia Marina. Now, if the Regia Marina had, on its, let's say, its best day, put everything out there, so given the losses at Taranto, let's say they put 2 Littorio class and 2 or possibly 3 Cavour Duilio class out there. So let's say there's five battleships total. It's either 3 modernized old ones and 2 Littorios, or right towards the very end of the war, at least for Italy. I mean, obviously Italy's being invaded at that point, but assuming it's an alternate timeline, if Roma is available, maybe 3 Littorios and 2 older ones, but probably realistically go for Littorio, Vittorio Veneto, and 3 older battleships, plus all their cruisers post-Matapan, plus all their destroyers, etc. That's a battle line that the Mediterranean fleet is going to struggle to break. You'd have to hit them repeatedly with aerial attacks from both Mediterranean Fleet and Force H carriers, probably drawing Ranger in to help as well, because she would have been in the area at the time. And but the thing is, at that point, if you're going to be throwing constant air attacks at the Italian forces, you might as well throw them at the troop transports and try and damage or sink those, because then the invasion can't happen, rather than going after the battleships, because it's questionable as to whether or not it'll work. Obviously, no attacks of sort of contact with the enemy, and you'd hope that the Regia Aeronautica would learn to provide some cover for the Italian fleet, but let's not hold our breath too much. But regardless, even if you damage the Italian escorting forces quite significantly, you still have to fight your way through them to get to the transports, whereas you just hit the transports, there's no point in the escorting fleet going any further. But nonetheless, if they did choose to go after the battle fleet instead, it's possible, if the Allies had enough warning of the invasion happening, which, the airdrop probably would have given them, if nothing else, as well as intel, then you might have been able to wear down the Italian fleet with air attacks and then hit it with the Mediterranean fleet on Force H, at which point it's potentially unlikely that the Italians will be able to protect them, but that's assuming the air attacks go relatively well. If they do achieve an element of surprise and the landings are already going on by the time the British figure out that the Italian ships are at sea, then it's a slightly different matter, because at that point the escort mission is over. The Italian fleet has much more freedom to maneuver. They just have to protect the landings, but they are now geographically tied down to protecting those landings, which could land them in a little bit of hot water, although their sheer strength, concentrated strength, would mean that the Allies could again face some issues. The main thing is that if such landings were prepared, chances are, if you're talking about 2 airborne divisions and 2 or 3 regular divisions and all the transports to move them and all the aircraft to move them and all the ships gathering to etc., somewhere along the line those plans are going to be discovered, which means you're going to have an ahistorical Mediterranean fleet and Force H, because reinforcements will be rushed to the area specifically to deal with the Italian fleet. So it does become a bit of a butterfly, assuming that it's a contested landing. As I say, if it is a complete failure to supply the island, Malta just has to surrender, and there's not a lot anyone can do about it. Knight 6831 asks, why were there no 20mm Oerlikons in HMS Vanguard's design? Well, there both are and are not. In Vanguard's original design, there were some 20mm included. In a number of design revisions throughout the early and mid part of World War II, she did have Oerlikon 20mm included, as well as unrotated projectile launchers and pom-poms. But first the unrotated projectile launchers, and then some of the pom-poms started disappearing, first in favour of more 20mm, and then the pom-poms and the 20mm began to disappear in favour of 40mm until you got the fit that Vanguard was actually completed with, which was all 40mm as her light medium AA defence. Now the reason for that is because as completed, she's a immediately post-war battleship, and by this point they'd run into the issue that I've spoken about a few times before, whereby the 20mm both was beginning to lose effectiveness in terms of stopping power against incoming enemy strike craft, and it was also beginning to lack in range. So the 20mm, almost from 6 months to a year after it was installed, was already appreciated as, against some aircraft, only capable of inflicting damage once the munitions had been released, which was still better than the 50 cal machine guns and such, which tended to be only if the enemy gets suicidally close to you weapons. But they could still reach out and knock out the occasional aircraft beyond certain aircraft's payload release range. But as the war went on, payload release ranges and aircraft speeds got higher and higher, and soon the 20mm was relegated to can only hit aircraft once they've released their payload. And by the end of the war, it was getting to a point, at least with things like the Fritz X and the various other German guided weapons, and indeed guided weapons that the Allies were coming up with as well, that unfortunately the 20mm now was completely inside of weapons payload release range, i.e., and also the aircraft pull-out range, i.e., an aircraft could launch an attack on a ship, drop its torpedo, missile, bomb, etc., and pull out of the attack and be away from the ship, all outside of the effective range, as opposed to the absolute range of an Oerlikon 20mm. Therefore, there was precious little point in having them anymore, and so the next option, the heavier option, was the Bofors 40mm, because that could reach out further and therefore was included in large numbers. Of course, the fundamental problem was that shortly after Vanguard entered service, it turned out that ever-increasing weapons ranges and aircraft speeds meant that even the Bofors 40mm became something of a very point defence weapon, and that's why subsequently you saw ships like HMS Tiger move up to automatic 3-inch guns instead, because you needed even further range. Albeit, obviously, in certain circumstances where aircraft are pressing their attacks right up close, the 40mm was still available. So, yeah, the reason Vanguard didn't complete with 20mm Oerlikons was because they were no longer considered an effective weapon at the time of her completion, but her original design did have them. And the corollary to that is that if Vanguard had been completed, well, delayed, I should say, if Vanguard had been delayed another 2 or 3 years and then completed in the early 50s, she probably wouldn't even have had any 40mm either. They probably would have ripped those out and substituted a certain number of single or twin automatic 3-inch instead. Ben Model asks, some old ships like HMS Warrior and SS Great Britain were used as oil hulks or storage for decades after growing obsolete for naval or civilian service, but then restored once their historic significance was realised. Are there any other ships like that presently that could be feasibly saved, i.e. not having to be raised off the ocean floor? In my hometown of Philly, there's SS United States, but despite various proposals over the years, nothing much has happened to it. There probably are, but finding them is a twofold issue. First of all, you've got things like, you say, like the SS United States. They're just so large that it would take an implausibly large amount of money for anything short of a national government or maybe a state government to actually do anything with it, because the cost of restoring such a ship, finding somewhere for it to berth, and then maintaining it is just astronomical. Then you've got the smaller ships. Now, if they do survive, and we don't already know about them, the thing is, there's not that many that we know of that could be restored to their original states and are afloat that haven't had that treatment already. There's a few sort of destroyer escorts and such that were converted to civilian ships, but broadly speaking, if we know about them, somebody, and they're relatively small, someone somewhere is already trying to restore them. But an awful lot of the ships in question will have been renamed and massively altered in order to, facilitate their use as something else. And over time, the knowledge of who and what those ships were has largely been forgotten, and then people eventually will show up and go, oh, that's actually this. But by that very nature, we don't know about them at the moment. There's a Russian river monitor, the Strelets, I think, which was rediscovered serving as a wharf within the last half-decade or so. Lissa, the Hungarian monitor that I visited and did a video on, that spent the best part of a century being, again, some part of river furniture before someone realised what it was. There's a couple of others out there as well. A couple of other river monitors that likewise have been found acting as pontoons and so forth and are in the process of restoration. So, yeah, I suspect there's probably, especially on the maybe few hundred to low 1,000-ton side, there's probably at least several dozen ships, probably mostly from the 19th and maybe early 20th century, that are masquerading as something else that no one's paying much attention to at the moment. older wise, early 19th and before wooden vessels, I don't think there's really anything left that could feasibly be saved, because it will either have rotted out by now or people will already know what they are and have made attempts to save them. Glenn Ricafrente asks, what was the point of the offset from centerline arrangements of the fore and aft guns on USS Boston? Was it to shorten the ship? As far as I can tell, assuming that I'm reading the rest of the deck plans of the ship correctly, the reason is more the fact that there's still engines and machinery going on along the centerline of the ships at the aft section, which means that the aft gun can't be on the centerline, a problem that repeated itself on a larger scale with some of the early dreadnoughts, and therefore it had to be offset one way or the other, and in so doing you couldn't put the forward gun on the centerline or on the same side, because that would result in a very unstable ship. So the forward gun therefore by default had to go on the other side in order to counterbalance the offset aft gun. Mainly looking at the aft plans for that, because if you look at the Oerlikons deck, you can see there's a huge void in the middle, which is presumably for the engine spaces, and that continues up beyond a point at which you could safely have a barbette, magazine, etc. coming straight down, so you have to instead have it offset slightly. Which, I say, is not exactly an unusual or unknown thing for warships generally in this period. It just results in a slightly odd-looking ship in this particular case. Greg O'Blenes asks, in one of your older videos you were talking about the Brooklyn-class USS Boise and how fast the class could fire. At the time you showed a picture of the guns, 3 turrets with large amounts of shell casings on the deck in front of the turrets. I was wondering if the cases were brass or steel, and if they were brass, did they dump them over the side or collect them for recycling? So that, I'm pretty sure, would be this photo. So first answer, yes, these are brass cartridges. Pretty much all cartridges used in naval warfare on largish guns, and let's face it, although a 6-inch gun isn't large in the grand scheme of things compared to a battleship gun, it's still pretty darn big, and you're talking about 152 or 155mm, depending on whether you're working as 6-inch guns or you're working the same caliber, roughly speaking, in metric, but anyway, or 150mm if you want a 5.9-incher. So yeah, brass cartridge cases all the way. Now, in terms of dumping them over the side or using them for collecting them for recycling, it depends very much on how those cartridges are being generated. So if it's a practice shoot, you've got the time, definitely keeping them for recycling. They'll be part of the duties of the crew once the exercise is complete. If it's in battle, then it depends on the situation. How quickly are they accumulating? What kind of battle situation are you in? Etc. and so on. No one's going to be going out onto the deck to deal with the cartridge cases whilst the ship is under fire. So, unless, of course, they build up in drift so large that they're causing problems for the turrets. But generally speaking, if the ship goes into action, fights at action, and thereafter is relatively speaking safe, then you'll probably see the cartridges retained because, it's useful war material. On the other hand, if the ship goes into a gun action, fights the gun action, there's drifts of cartridges floating around the deck, and the ship's still at action stations or shortly to be at action stations, maybe they're worried about the enemy coming back, maybe they're worried about air attack or something like that, then at that point the majority of the cartridges are just going to get chucked, because otherwise they're a shrapnel hazard and there's no time to delegate crew to pull them back in. So in the most dire of circumstances, they will go overboard. Obviously, a lot bit of it does also depend on the temperament of the captain and the gun crews, but where possible, usually the brass would be retained either for reuse or repurposing. Craig Hagenbruch asks, in reference to a question about HMS Hermes in her anti-piracy role, Like modern-day civilian-crewed vessels, did commercial crewed shipping of the early 20th century try to defend themselves from boarding by spraying water hoses to prevent the pirates from climbing up the sides of the ships? Also, when did navies go from shoot first, ask questions later to firing shots over the bow with the heave to and we intend to board you warning? So when it comes to boarding merchant ships, warships have used the shot across the bow method for pretty much as long as they've had guns, actually. Early on, obviously, ammunition is precious and takes a while to reload, so a single warning shot is much better than having to expend significant amounts of ammo and time trying to shoot things. And later on, an undamaged ship full of valuable cargo is worth a lot more prize money than one that you've turned into a wooden colander. So it's much better in that sense as well. Obviously, that only applies when you are a warship going after a merchant vessel. If you're going after another warship or a vessel you suspect of being another warship, then it is pretty much always going to be a shoot first, shoot second, shoot third, and ask questions of the smoking wreckage afterwards, because any other way, you end up on the receiving end of the shooting. In terms of early 20th century piracy, whilst there were some what you might call traditional piratical events using powered boats, because obviously by the 20th century, let's say by the 1920s, most merchant ships were steam powered, and so a sailing junk is not really going to help in that all that much. Most pirates of the time, therefore, would use somewhat a method that's a bit more like a late 20th century airline hijacking, where they'd sneak aboard disguised as passengers or possibly even crew with concealed weapons, and then whilst the ship is underway, they'd just pop up on deck heavily armed, demanding that everyone stand down, and they'd take over the ship and do what they wanted with it. That didn't always work out, and much as obviously some of the more famous incidents of airline hijacking in the early 21st century led to the fortification of aircraft cabins, the ships that were in the vicinity where this kind of piracy was the most prevalent ended up fortifying their bridge and wheelhouse. There are even photos of ships with barbed wire and improvised armor plate, as well as the crew being armed with their own small arms, effectively turning the conning tower, bridge, whatever it was, into a small fortress. That sometimes worked, sometimes didn't. It depended on if you got enough notice of the pirates. But obviously there's not a lot that you can do in terms of hosing them off the ship because they're already on the ship. In terms of the ones that still stuck to the traditional attack one ship with another ship method, the larger problem there was that at the time pirates would be a lot more free with their small arms than perhaps the pirates are today. So it's relatively unlikely, for instance, that if pirates try to climb the side of a cruise liner and somebody just turns a fire hose on them, it's relatively unlikely that the pirates in the motorboat that's nearby are going to open fire with automatic rifles and shoot the guy who's operating the fire hose. Back in those days, that would have been very much on the cards. Plus, of course, the merchant ships were slower and nowhere near as large as they are these days for the most part. And so you'd have far less time. If somebody slung a ladder over the side of a 8, 10, 12,000 ton freighter, they could be up that ladder in a matter of seconds and over, and then you had to deal with them on the deck, as opposed to these days, where if you're attacking a modern cruise liner or a modern merchant ship, it might be an 80 to 100 foot climb just to get over the side, at which point you've got a fair amount of time to come up with a non-lethal solution to the problem. Texas and LaShock asks, this question is inspired by a bit of humour from when I was a kid living on the Azores. There was a US naval air station which was the primary facility, but the Army would sometimes come in to practice amphibious landings, and the Air Force had a small office of some sort. So the joke was that the Navy flew the planes, the Army sailed the ships, and the Air Force cut the grass. Humour aside, has there ever been an instance of an actual role reversals in military actions where the Navy filled the role of some other branch while that or another branch held the sea? I can't think of many offhand where there was a complete role reversal in terms of active combat. You do, of course, have odd things like this where the Royal Navy shows up on the front lines of the Western Front at the beginning of World War One in armoured cars. So you have the Navy fighting on land in what are effectively small armoured vehicles. And, of course, depending on the country in question, elements or perhaps even most of the amphibious forces of a particular nation might be under the control of the army or their equivalent of a marine unit, as opposed to the navy. In some navies, obviously, it's under control of the navy itself. But in those cases, there could be instances where perhaps, say, there's a large landing going on a beach, and most, if not all, the ships in immediate attendance actually belong to the army, and the only strictly naval presence might be a naval shore party that's doing spotting for distant cover or helping manage the beach or something like that. But obviously that's going to be a very transient situation. And I suppose technically when you're doing air-sea rescues in World War II, a good chunk of those would have been done by RAF Coastal Command, Sunderland's, or the related similar flying boats for the various other nations. You know, all the flying boats were in Germany under the control of the Luftwaffe, for instance. So in those cases, technically, whilst those flying boats were touched down, the Air Force would be the one with the ships, and the Navy would be, well, the sailors in the water, and the nearest naval vessel is still in port. But yeah, I can't think of any other full role reversals. Like in World War One, I can think of examples where the Navy shows up in weird places, like on land or in the middle of the skies over country, miles and miles away from the sea. But I can't think of too many where the Army or the Air Force end up with the presence at sea at the same time that the Navy's on the land. Captain Landlocked asks, when did ramming fall out of fashion, Lissa notwithstanding, and was it because a broadside could deter a galley, or was it because ships grew in strength, enabling to withstand a ramming attack? Thinking especially about the Mediterranean and Black Sea region. Ramming as a tactic kind of dies a very long, slow death, and it is very regional, and admittedly, again, we are looking mostly at the kind of Western focus of things, because how naval fights were conducted in the Far East, for example, Japan, Korea, China, etc., is a very different story. But if we're looking at the Mediterranean, North Sea and Atlantic context, at least, ramming as a significant tactic kind of begins to fall off with the demise of what you might call the ancient world. And then you have what used to be called the Dark Ages, now people call it the Migration Period or whatever, and effectively ships with rams are no longer really around for the most part in Northern Europe. There are various stories in the Viking sagas of some long ships that seem to be set up in some way, shape or form for ramming, but by the time national polities start to get re-established and navies start to become a thing again, at least in Northern Europe, ramming, as you'd understand it in a Greco-Roman context of we have a big ram prow, we're trying to smash a hole in the enemy, has pretty much gone by the wayside. Technically speaking, in terms of we're putting our ship in contact with the other ship, possibly at speed, that kind of ramming is still around, but it's more in the context of making sure you're close enough to board the enemy, not in terms of actually trying to physically destroy them without boarding. But in the Mediterranean, it persists for a lot longer. It dies off somewhat in importance because you have things like the Byzantine Greek fire and ships getting gradually larger, and so it becomes harder and harder to actually make a ram worth something, because the bigger ships are usually a bit slower and definitely a lot clumsier, so it's a lot more difficult to get them into a ramming position. Smaller, lighter galleys can still ram and still do, but they start to become, as ships develop, only really effective against each other, because the biggest and largest ships tend to be big enough to just shrug off galley ramming attacks, because they are just, as you say, they grow in size and strength. Now, there is a confluence of the two, because you do have various galleys, both Mediterranean galleys just hired as mercenaries and sailed into Northern Europe. You see them at the Battle of Sluis. There's Genoese or however you pronounce it, but there's Genoese galleys there. There's various galleys, both Frenchman and mercenary, at the Battle of the Solent when the Mary Rose sinks. The Royal Navy has a few galleys in the Anthony Roll of Henry VIII's time, and there's still a handful of ramming-style vessels around at the time of the Armada, albeit by the time the battles really get stuck in, it's a handful of galleasses, which are much bigger ships with considerable firepower. But that is kind of the end, what you call it, the end of the 16th century, is basically when ramming as a direct tool of doing damage to the enemy has kind of seen its last gasp in Northern Europe, except for, as you mentioned, occasional revivals in the Black Sea, in the Baltic. Flipping, I haven't made that mistake in a while. Yeah, so the occasional revival of galley warfare in the Baltic, when Peter the Great and that kind of conflict. But in the Mediterranean, it persists a lot longer, which is why you've had this painting of Lepanto up for a while, because Lepanto actually happens barely a decade earlier than the Spanish Armada, but there's an awful lot of galleys present and an awful lot of ramming and boarding going on. But it kind of, again, shows the way forward, because a lot of these galleys are being either shattered or blown apart, either by gunfire or by just hitting much, much bigger vessels. And so whilst galleys as road vessels tend to still have some advantages in the Mediterranean through speed and agility, the use of the galley as a ramming weapon to do damage to your opponent also starts dropping off in the Mediterranean, whereas the end of the 16th century is kind of the very last gasp of its effectiveness in Northern Europe for the most part. It persists in the Mediterranean a bit longer. The Barbary pirates, for example, still have quite a number of galleys even as late as the 18th century, albeit they're somewhat less heavy on the ramming and somewhat more about the boarding and the gunfire by that point. And yeah, so it's a combination of the growth of ships just becoming strong enough to resist them. I mean, there's tales even from the early Crusades periods of rather helpless European hulks and cogs that have come with either crusaders or supplies for crusaders getting into the eastern part of the Mediterranean, being becalmed or suffering very light breezes, so they can't really go anywhere. And then some of the bigger ones, especially when carracks start to be seen in the air in the latter part of the medieval era, being beset by Saracen or Ottoman galleys and galleots. And you kind of get this odd standoff where the galleys are throwing themselves against the much larger northern European ships and just bouncing off the thick hull timbers, not really accomplishing all that much. But equally, the European ship is effectively just a slightly drifting fortress that can't really take offensive counteraction against these small attackers. And usually those kind of tales end with a breeze blowing up, and it allows the European ship to just sail off with nothing much gained by either side, other than some interesting scratches on the paintwork. But the galleass, for example, could still ram, but yeah, running into ram in the face of gunfire, especially as gunfire starts to grow with heavy broadsides, does also become more and more suicidal, and so it slowly dies off. Although, as I say, we're talking purely about the ramming to cause damage to your opponent, as opposed to ramming your opponent as part of a boarding action, which still persists quite commonly throughout the 17th and 18th and into the 19th century. I mean, half of the ships at Trafalgar that ended up fighting broadside to broadside were as the result, initially at least, of some kind of ramming that obviously was relatively low speed. Matt Kidd asks, how did USS Enterprise not get preserved? The US was a wealthy nation in 1950, with many World War II US Navy veterans in powerful positions in government. It seems incredible that the ship was scrapped. It definitely was, but it relates to two things. One, the decision to scrap Enterprise was taken at the end of the 1950s, which was a lot sooner than the decision to scrap most of the Essex class. So there is a degree of the whole thing where as something gets older, it gets more valued, which is part of the reason why there are so many Essex class still around. But also it relates to a question that I answered, I believe, slightly earlier in the month, or possibly it might have been in the Patreon Drydock, about last month, about ships and names. Because a ship with a name that's associated with a particular location, especially when it comes to the US, because let's face it, we're talking about US ship preservation here. A ship that's carrying a state name or a city name has something intrinsic that it can use as a tie-in to a particular area, especially obviously if the city is or state is coastal. So you can have veterans groups and historians who want a ship preserved, but of course even ex-crew of the Enterprise will be scattered across the United States. So individual fundraising efforts, of which there were quite a few, never quite managed to reach enough money. Whereas if a ship is named after a particular location, you can obviously raise money, but you can also put a certain amount of pressure on that local city or state authority who have something of an investment in it because it carries their name. Whereas if you approach a state government or a city government with a request to have Enterprise there, you can make lots of appeals to the ship's history, which to you and me would obviously make a lot of sense, but to the kind of faceless bureaucratic drones you usually find in local government, and yes, I know, I can say that, I used to be one, then for the most part, they're just going to be sitting there going, well, why do we care? Someone who's sitting at that kind of level of decision making in the late 1950s, early 1960s is probably unlikely to be a World War II veteran. They're probably going to be maybe a generation younger than that, and they might academically appreciate the idea, but they're not intrinsically going to appreciate it. They'll be like, well, why here? Why not over there or somewhere else where they have to spend the money to preserve it? And I think that's the hurdle the Enterprise just about didn't manage to clear, unfortunately. If the various funding efforts had all been pooled, there would have been more than enough money, but they weren't because they were scattered a bit all over the place. And I mean, technically, if you want to get really pernickety, you can argue that the US Navy is somewhat at fault for demanding people pay several $100,000 for the ship to have it as a museum as opposed to just giving it to someone. But at the same time, you can kind of see the logic in as much as, if someone can't raise $200,000 to buy the ship, what are the chances they're going to be able to raise the money to pay for the ship's mooring, pay for the ship's preservation, and then it's all going to be very embarrassing. Although, if it was me, I'd sort of get a happy medium of kind of like, you have to raise X amount of money in order for us to give you the ship, and then use that money to actually preserve the ship, rather than, great, you've bought a carrier, now you have to start at square one from your fundraising again, which is how a lot of those early museum ships had to be set up. Robert Henry Ilston asks, an addendum to the dual versus single mount debate for destroyers. Since the threat from air attack was becoming a larger focus in the last half of the Pacific campaign, wouldn't having more tubes that could cover different fire arcs, especially with the introduction of the VT fuse for the 5-inch dual-purpose guns, mean that a ship with, say, 6 single mounts versus 4 doubles could be more effective at air defence since it could cover more arcs? Or am I missing something? Were there any such vessels planned or built? A few slightly odd conversions of older ships were considered of that kind, but the main problem is that whilst a dual mount is a somewhat larger, somewhat heavier, the overall increase in footprint that it occupies isn't that much greater. So if your ship can fit a dual mount, it's better to fit a dual mount than a single because you have double the number of guns. Whereas if you use singles, obviously each one, especially on a relatively thin vessel like a destroyer, has to be spaced out along the centre line, and you just flat out might not have so much space to put those things on. Additionally, obviously, 6 single mounts versus 4 doubles, the 4 doubles have a total of 8 barrels. So as long as you are directing those guns down up to 4 lines of attack, you're actually chucking more fire downrange than the 6 singles could. And to be perfectly honest, if you're looking at a destroyer-sized vessel, and it has 6 separate attacks coming down 6 separate vectors or more, that all require a heavy dual-purpose anti-aircraft gun at least to deal with, you're probably going to die anyway, to be perfectly honest. So it's probably not going to change all that much. Whereas, 4 incoming, well, you're probably still doomed anyway, but at least the 4 incoming have 2 shells flying at them rather than the 1, so there's a slightly larger impact there. So the other thing is you've got to remember is with the dual guns, whilst yes the VT fuse exists and so forth, it's not a absolute precise science. The fire control computers aren't 100% reliable, otherwise you wouldn't have to throw thousands upon thousands of shells at something to shoot things down. So having the dual mounts has another advantage, which is that the guns themselves are not going to be absolutely 100% perfectly aligned, and 2, you can actually introduce deliberate slight misalignment or slight differences in the fuse settings if you're using a timed fuse as opposed to the VT fuse, which stands for variable times, actually radar controlled proximity fuse, but regardless, you can stagger your fire. So if your fire control system says, right, you need to aim here, then you can, as either by slightly changing the elevation of the gun or slightly changing when you fire, you can stagger your shells a little bit so that you're covering a slightly larger kill zone. So there are a number of significant advantages to a dual mount over a single. Now, on larger ships where you can just fit a multiplicity of guns, there may be more of an argument, but as I said, on the smaller ships, I think having the 8 barrels, even if you can focus them down slightly fewer fire lanes, probably makes more sense overall than having fewer single mountings, because a single heavy AA gun, even with VT fuses and radar guiding, is not a particularly brilliant thing. Yes, there are a few 3-inch autoloaders post-war, but there's also preference for 3-inch twin autoloaders, and as you can see here, has been accompanying us during this question, the French cruiser de Grasse, known to those of you who play World of Warships, or this alternatively her immediate successor, the Colbert. Well, they embraced the cover everything in anti-aircraft turrets and beam, as you can see, although also, as you can see, these were twin mounts. DJ Hurd asks, a friend of mine commented that Iowa, the state, has produced excellent naval officers. I had never heard this before. Do you know of any such naval officers? Well, without wanting to get too deep into the politics of which state produces the best officers, Iowa has produced a reasonable number of decent naval officers. I mean, Admiral Fletcher, as seen here, is one of them. The Sullivan brothers were all from Iowa as well. So, yeah, there are a fair number of US naval officers from Iowa who attained fairly high rank. Admiral Fletcher's father as well was Frank Friday Fletcher, also attained 4-star. Well, he attained 4-star admiral rank. Obviously, Admiral Fletcher went one better in World War II, and the Fletcher-class destroyers are named for his father, not for him. So, yeah, there are excellent naval officers that have come out of Iowa. Having gone through the full list of all US 4-star and 5-star admirals up to the end of the time period that the channel covers, Iowa doesn't seem to stand out particularly from all of the others. It has its decent share, but if anything, I'd say Tennessee and Vermont and maybe Texas towards the end seem to show up slightly more often than the other states. But I only had time to go through the 4- and 5-star admirals up to 1950. There may very well be a number of excellent captains and 1- and 2- and 3-star admirals from Iowa that I'm not aware of. So someone who's a bit more familiar with the precise state origins of various US naval officers can possibly comment below. Jorg 2 asks, is there a reason that battleships didn't use ballast to hide more of their hull underwater during combat? It seems fairly logical at first glance. Hide your armour belt below the waterline when it matters, in a gun duel for example, but do this by taking on ballast water would mean the ship would still have a decent freeboard in other conditions. Is this something that was done, and if not, why wasn't it done? It was a concept that was explored with some of the early low freeboard ironclads. It was thought that perhaps, but they had, as I say, fairly low freeboard in the first place, so it was thought that, well, if we submerge ourselves a bit further in battle, it's actually going to be almost impossible to hit us, because effectively you just have a bit of superstructure showing, which isn't that important in the grand scheme of things, probably important to the people who are in it. Funnels, a little bit of a problem. Turrets, already heavily armoured and very small targets, and the rest of it, if the rest of it's underwater, it's protected from incoming fire. Result. And then pop back up again afterwards, pretty much like you suggest. The problem with that, and the reason why it was only really even looked at with these low freeboard ironclads, is, well, there's several problems. One is, as you submerge, more of your hull is underwater, there's more resistance going forward, which means that you are going to slow down, which can put your enemy at a maneuverability advantage and a speed advantage, which you don't want, because obviously with more of your hull underwater, more surface area to resist turning, it's also going to be harder for you to maneuver. So that's a problem. Secondly, the amount of water that you would need to submerge the ship. For a low freeboard ironclad, okay, maybe not so much. For a high freeboard ship in the 20th century, you'd need an absolutely ridiculous amount of water. And to the point that you'd probably actually overcome the ship's natural buoyancy. And that could be a significant problem if you wanted to hide all of the hull, because you would end up permanently hiding all of the hull on the seabed, which I suppose, yes, technically your armour isn't breached, but the enemy's going to be thanking you for that particular effort. And the other problem with hiding your armour belt is that your new waterline is now unprotected or minimally protected, depending if you've got an all-or-nothing or distributed armour scheme ship, which means that hits that you do take are going to cause extensive flooding, because the shell's just going to go straight through. And then you've got flooding, you've got fires, you've got explosions, everyone's running around screaming and panicking and dying. And then you have one of the many things that was a contributory factor to what killed the Bismarck, the free surface effect. Because if you have your citadel made up of your armour belt and armour deck, which are now well underwater, and you've got a large amount of water on top of that, well, the ship's going to be naturally rolling with the swell anyway, even if it's not already rolling, because there's a bunch of water on one side and not the other. And as that water that's now inside all collects and pools on one side of your ship, that's going to massively change your centre of balance, the centre of gravity, and possibly make your ship roll over and then sink, even if it technically hasn't reached a point of negative buoyancy yet. Because once it rolls over, you'll get lots of water pouring down vents and funnels and stuff, and then you will reach negative buoyancy very, very quickly. Plus, being on your side is not really a good place to be for a battleship, or any kind of ship, really. Plus, if you're using ballast, you've reduced your ship's overall buoyancy levels, so any level of flooding could be potentially disastrous. So, using, again, completely arbitrary figures. So, let's say, for the sake of argument, that a 35,000-ton battleship has 15,000 tons of reserve buoyancy. It's probably a little bit more than that. Prince of Wales was just about afloat with somewhat more than that in terms of water aboard, although she was going down slowly as more and more water came on board. But nevertheless, let's say 15,000 tons. So how much are you going to take on board? I mean, obviously, with a high freeboard, you're not going to submerge the entire thing, which leads to the problems we discussed earlier. But let's say you want to reduce your freeboard somewhat. You don't care about the maneuverability, you don't care about the speed or anything else. You're just lowering the ship for whatever reason. So you take on 10,000 tons of water. Okay, you've reduced the ship's freeboard somewhat. You now have 5,000 tons of reserve buoyancy. That's what's keeping you up. You now take a torpedo hit. It's going to either impact on the belt armour or above the belt armour, because your torpedo defences are now much lower in the water because you're lower than you should be. So it's almost certainly going to breach. You're going to have a lot of water come pouring into compartments that aren't designed for it. And aside from the free surface effect, let's say it's a big torpedo. Let's say it's a long lance or something. you probably now have 3,000 or 4,000 tons of water aboard, and it's all on one side. At that point, you probably roll over and sink in very, very short order. But let's assume that the enemy is being kind, or perhaps they're trying to be a bit clever. They do a pincer attack. They hit you with 2 torpedoes, one from each side. Let's say you take on 3,500 tons of water from each of those hits, because they're not directly adjacent to each other or opposite each other. And now you've taken on 7,000 tons of water. You only had 5,000 tons of reserve buoyancy left, and now you have 2,000 tons net negative buoyancy, and down you go. That's the end of you, again, in very short order. Whereas if you still had your 15,000 tons of reserve buoyancy, then assuming that you only took your 3,500 tons of water on per torpedo, which is less likely because hopefully those torpedoes will hopefully hit your torpedo defences, which will reduce the flooding still further. But even if that didn't happen, let's say you take a bow hit and a stern hit, you now still have 8,000 tons of reserve buoyancy aboard if you haven't already partially flooded yourself. So you're in trouble, but you're still afloat. Admittedly, at that point, people are just going to put more torpedoes into you, but it's going to take a lot longer for you to sink. So, yeah. Basically, for a high freeboard ship, it just flat out doesn't work. It presents far more problems than it could solve. For an ironclad ship that's not having to worry about torpedoes, not having to worry about air attack, and already has a fairly low freeboard, there is a marginal amount of utility to it, but it's a very complex thing to set up, and you're still compromising on speed and agility. Plus, it does make you more vulnerable to ramming, because your opponent at that point can probably just literally force you under, the equivalent of waterboarding an entire ship, but not letting go. So it'll keep you a little bit more alive right up until it doesn't, and then it makes you very, very, very much more dead. So yeah, unfortunately not a particularly viable tactic. And that concludes this week's Drydock. Thank you very much for listening once again. No particular comments on what's going on in the world, because I don't know what's going to be going on in the world at the time that I'm recording this compared to the time it's going to be released, because hopefully today, if you're listening to the time of release, I should be on the deck of USS Midway. Last week I should have been probably in the Smithsonian. So hopefully all is working out, and I'm somewhere in San Diego at this point. Thanks very much for listening, and hope to see you again in another video.